Part 4 of Work of the Sisters During the Epidemic of Influenza, October 1918, by Francis Edward TOURSCHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4. Holmesburg Emergency, Number 1. After Mass and Holy Communion, 6 sisters start for Holmesburg from St. Veronica's. Now, to find where the hospital is, we inquired from the car conductors, who were most kind to us when they learned that we were to take care for the sick. One gentleman in the car paid our fares, then said in a loud voice, for the benefit of all in the car, "Now, what would Philadelphia do if it were not for these good women?" After much anxiety, we reached emergency number 1. There we met a nurse wearing a mask and a long white robe. She conducted us to the office of the head nurse, and in 2 minutes we had our masks and gowns on, worn over the habit of blue serge, and were ready for work. There were over 300 patients and only 12 nurses, this was October 11, to look after them, so one can imagine the distress, the neglect, and the misery of these poor creatures. Some did not have their faces washed for days before we came. Their bed-clothing had not been changed for a like period of time. The nurses were almost distracted. They could not attend to the sick, and indeed they gave the sisters a warm welcome. My first day in ward number 3, the women's ward, I shall never forget. One cannot imagine it. 90 women so sick and so helpless, moaning, coughing. Some were partly delirious. Others would get out of bed and follow us around the ward, begging us to be allowed to go home. Then, to try to quiet them, others were calling for ice water, an ice cap, a hot water bag, a priest, a doctor. It is beyond description. Several times during the first 4 days, we would stand aside in the corridors and on the stairways to give place to the men who were carrying out dead bodies. The first day we saw 13 bodies carried out to the dead house within 4 hours. The odor from this dead house was something dreadful. We could notice it 2 squares away. On the second day, they dug a trench on the grounds and placed the dead bodies in it until the relatives could have the remains removed. About the 4th day, everything became more quiet, and we had things in fine working order. Miss Reeder remarked one day, "I am not a Catholic, but it is surprising to see the change there is in this place since the sisters came." The first week we were on duty from 7 a.m. until 7 p.m. Then the night force relieved us. The second week we arose at 3:30 a.m. and were out at the hospital before 5 o'clock. We were then on duty till 2 p.m. During these hours we had never a minute to waste. We began, as soon as we came on duty, washing faces, combing hair, making the sick generally comfortable. Then they were ready for breakfast. This meant to prepare 90 trays to carry them to the beds. After breakfast, to collect them all again. This kept us busy until 10 o'clock a.m., the time for their liquid diet, which meant 90 cups of either milk, orange juice, or ice water. Then changed their night dresses. This kept us until 12 o'clock, time for diet again. Many improved and went home well, who, if they had not been brought to the hospital, would have died of neglect. Another sister writes, "I left Germantown early the next morning, October 10, for Holmesburg. During the day, 2 sisters came from St. Monica's, and the 3 of us went to the hospital. Our experience of the first night can hardly be described, as the place was anything but ready. Only a few nurses and 3 poor sisters without any experience. They did not stop bringing in patients during the whole night. We had as many as 3 and 4, always waiting to be put to bed. Thank God, the next night things had wonderfully improved. Everything now seemed to be in working order, and plenty of good help from various sources. First of all, the good sisters, some firemen from different firehouses, and some prisoners from the prison, House of Correction, who were serving time. All worked faithfully and seemed willing and eager to do anything to be helpful. I remained on night duty from October 10 to October 28, working 12 hours from 7 to 7. During this time I had the consolation of some conversions and of seeing many return to the sacraments. Not one Catholic under my observation died without receiving the last sacraments. The sisters from Germantown were taken to Holmesburg daily in a private car. Their hours on duty were 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. The poor suffering men, writes one of the sisters in her report to the superior, were cheered by our presence, and in addition to the physical services we could render them, many of them were spiritually benefited. Our garb, of course, represented religion to many of these poor sufferers. Many asked for our prayers, and I humbly believe many of them were brought to make good acts of contrition, and so had a good death because of our presence. As is usual, we also made a favorable impression upon many of the non-Catholics. Numbers of them were at least taught to say their prayers, and many asked us about our faith. One poor Jew, who knew nothing about religion, noticed the Sacred Heart badge pinned on my apron and asked, "Why do you wear the picture of Christ?" I explained to him how we ask the Sacred Heart, which symbolizes God's love in the sacred humanity of Jesus, to protect us. "If the Christ will protect you," he said, "why not pin one on me, so that I too may ask him to cure me?" I pinned it on. While doing so, I asked him what he would do if he got better. "Then I'll wear it," he answered, "that he may protect me during the remainder of my life." Another sister reports to her superior, "At first we had great trouble about transportation, leaving home, St. Monica's, about 4 in the morning and getting back about 9 p.m. In the intervening hours, we were engaged constantly waiting on the sick and dying. I was assigned to the women's acute ward. This meant that death was anticipated for the patients in that ward. I was present at many, many deaths and tried to help them turn their last thoughts to God. One case impressed me deeply. A Lutheran woman lay dying on a cot. Her little girl, a mere baby, lay very ill in the next cot. The mother became unconscious, and for hours the child tugged at the white screen, which was placed around the dying bed, begging a word from her mother. The mother died, and yet the baby called. A week or so later, the little one was taken away to a home, but still questioning the apparent neglect of her mother. Many of the patients were Catholics and appreciated the badges of the Sacred Heart which were given them. As usual, the Jews thought they were missing something, and some of them asked for a red ticket, too. Another sister tells of what appeared to be an interminable ride by trolley, an hour and 30 minutes from the convent to the home for the indigent at Byberry. The sisters were not familiar with car routes, and had been told to inquire from the conductors how to reach the home for the indigent. They were amused, perhaps a little humbled, to hear the instructions of one conductor to another as they changed trolleys. "These ladies for the home of the indigent." The first experience of this same sister after reaching the hospital was a scene of singular pathos, yet one of the not unusual occurrences during the epidemic. Shortly after the sister's entrance into the ward, an Italian woman died. By her side were her brother and her son, a boy of 15, who could not speak English. The sister was moved to pity by the uncontrolled sobbing of the boy. As she knew that the body must be removed, she tried to offer some consolation. She then, through an interpreter, an Italian working on the place, learned that the boy's father lay at home dead, and that he had not $1 in the world to meet the cost of burying the remains of his parents. Finally, we advised them to consult the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, and we felt that they would receive assistance. In contrast to the above experience is one of the following day, told by the same sister. A very respectable colored woman was seriously ill, and I observed that the screen, which is usually put around the bed of the dying, was placed around her bed. By the side of the bed, 2 other colored women were kneeling, and a tall man stood at the head of the bed. Seeing the weeping women kneeling and thinking that I might be of some service, I stepped close to them and asked, "Are you Catholics?" "No," replied one of the women, "but Helen thought she might like to receive communion before she dies." "And is this your minister?" said I. "Yes." Turning to me, the minister then said that he thought Helen's head should be raised slightly while she swallowed the contents of a wine-glass which he held. I gladly raised Helen's head, spoke a word or two of consolation, and went away, never thinking of a communion service. A few minutes later, I met a Catholic nurse who told me the details. The minister, on arriving at the hospital, had asked for wine. There was no wine. Brandy was then asked for. There was none to be found in the drug department. "But we have whiskey." He accepted the substitute, whiskey. "Now, may I have a little bread?" he asked. It was found that there was no bread in the building. "But we have crackers, and Unita biscuits." These were accepted, crackers and whiskey, materia apta for Helen's last communion. Instead of a stimulant, as the sisters thought, these were the sacramental elements in the subjective and sincere faith of the participants of the most sacred and divine rite in the heritage of Christian religion. Whatever the results, physiological or psychological, of the crackers and whiskey, Helen improved, and when the sister left the hospital, she was a promising convalescent. Another sister reports, "One man said to me, 'Sister, God must have sent me here to change my opinion of you Catholic ladies. I hated Catholics before this epidemic. Now I shall revere the name of the Catholic sisterhoods and defend them as my life. You good ladies came here to nurse us at the risk of your own lives, and I have learned my lesson. God bless you.'" One of the sisters reports this bit of revelation of the psychology of human nature, colored. "There was a rift in the clouds of sorrow at times," she says, "that we find amusing now in the retrospect. A colored girl who was helping in the diet kitchen thought she missed two of the sisters one night, and finally she asked, 'Where are your two little blue-eyed girls tonight? I sure hope they're not sick.' I told her that they were in another ward on duty. After considerable thought, she asked, 'Is it true that they have not been out after dark for 6 years?' 'Yes,' I replied, 'and I have not been out after nightfall for 25 years. She could find no words adequate to express her astonishment, but for days she repeated this choice bit of gossip to everyone who came in any way near her vicinity. Women's Hospital, 40th and Parish. Two sisters of the Immaculate Heart from St. Agatha's Convent served here on night duty 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. One of the sisters writes, "We were inexperienced, but tried to follow out the doctor's orders. We watched carefully, and especially when we found a patient's chart marked serious. Each night we assisted at several deaths. After respiration ceased, we prepared the bodies for the morgue. The month of October, 1918, numbers some of the most memorable, and I trust some of the most meritorious days of my life." Another sister tells of her experience and impressions. "Leaving the convent each evening about 7 o'clock, we were on duty until 7 next morning. I was appointed to a ward where the violent patients were cared for. It was a terrible sight to behold. I shudder to recall it. The poor victims, some delirious and screaming, others trying to sleep, and still others breathing their last. I was instructed to keep a close watch that no one got out of bed. There was one woman who weighed over 200 who had to be carefully watched. She had made vain attempts to get away, and was now strapped to the bed. She was violently tearing the bedclothes. I remember how, after this woman died, I trembled when the nurse asked me to assist her in preparing the body for burial. I feared to show reluctance. I had no experience, but offered to do my best. Another evening, on reaching the ward, I found a colored lady giving considerable trouble. Toward midnight, her screams and shrieks in delirium were terrible. While I assisted the nurse in strapping her to the bed, she attempted to strike me with a glass tumbler, and nearly tore the uniform off the nurse. She would have injured us both if we had not quickly overpowered her and strapped her securely to the bed. Each night was a repetition of the previous one, bathing the sick, distributing medicines, giving nourishment, preparing the dead for the morgue. This continued for 2 weeks, when at last the plague was under control, and we returned to our convent with memories of an experience which will remain as long as we live. Phoenixville Hospital. A sister sent to Phoenixville for relief work from the convent of the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart, Sacred Heart Parish, Philadelphia, gives her experience in part. She says that most of the patients, in fact, as it appeared to us, all were foreigners, Italians, Poles, Slavs, Lithuanians. We could hardly understand a word they uttered. We learned later to know them by their first names, the last, family name, being usually too difficult to spell and impossible to pronounce. In many instances, entire families were in the hospital. One case in particular, a family of 7, came under our notice. From the mother of this family came the pleading request every time we passed the bed. "Sis, you get a my man. Sis, just a 5-minute me look at my man." After vain attempts to quiet the fears of the poor sick woman, the sisters, believing that they had located the man wanted, a convalescent in the men's ward, had him brought to Rosie, who, with loud protests and gesticulations, gave evidence that he was not the man in request, and renewed her pleading. "Sis, just a 5-minute me look at my man." This same sister gives an interesting description of the death of a young woman, a Slav of powerful frame. A young man, who came to the hospital every day to act as interpreter, told her of her dangerous condition. Immediately she began to sing very plaintively. We asked him what she was saying. He told us that she was begging God for mercy. We lighted the candle, and procuring holy water, we began to recite the prayers for the dying. As there was no crucifix at hand, I took mine from the chain and placed it in her hand. She pressed it to her lips very devoutly. She died repeating after the sisters the beautiful aspiration, "My Jesus, mercy." During the recitation of prayers for the dying, the sister says, every other sound was hushed in the ward. The nurses marveled and expressed their surprise at the power of this simple act of religion to quiet the moaning and the constant appeals of the other sufferers in the ward. One of the nurses, herself a convalescent, remarked, when first she saw the sisters without the mask, how young they appeared, and she was impressed especially by one sister's youthful appearance, whom she judged to be about 21. That sister is a Jubilarian, 25 years, professed in religion. After conditions in the hospital were gotten well under control, the Philadelphia sisters assisted their associates of the Phoenixville community in the work of district nursing in a section of the town known as the Italian or foreign settlement. Judging from the sisters' vivid description of experiences here, these were foreigners not only to American customs and ways of life, but too often strangers to cleanliness and sanitary surroundings. Truly, most of us know little, perhaps under ordinary conditions care less, about how the rest of us live or exist. After 2 weeks of this experience, the sister says, we returned to our convent, glad to have been able to do some little service for suffering humanity. They returned from the passing experience of public notice to the daily routine of schoolwork, the work of a life devoted to the training of the spirit, the minds and affections of other men's children, a work less prominent in the eye of the public, but of vital importance to the religion and morals of the growing generation, the support and security of the social and civil life for the future. Pottsville, Sisters IHM. One of the sisters who had previously been doing district nursing in the parish of St. Francis de Sales describes the call for help in Pottsville, the meeting of 10 sisters, the number was later increased to 14, at the station for the train which leaves Philadelphia, 4:30 p.m., their arrival and their welcome by the Sisters of St. Joseph at St. Patrick's Convent, Pottsville, October 10. The sisters were so distributed as to have some of them on duty at each of the 3 hospitals during both shifts, night and day, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. That night, October 10, writes this sister, 3 other sisters and myself were appointed for night duty. These were my hours on duty during my 2-week stay in Pottsville. I shall never forget my first night's experience in the Armory Emergency Hospital, where there were on one floor about 80 men and on the other about 100 women. The hardest thing of all, especially for one who had never before witnessed death, was to see these strong men dying off one after the other. It was remarkable that even the non-Catholics asked the sisters to remain near them, and in their dying moments they would repeat the beautiful aspiration, "My Jesus, mercy." End of Part 4.